And we're live. Hi, Natalie.
Hey, how's it going?
I'm good. How are you? Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, you're an ex-Team Canada snowboarder. You're an entrepreneur. You're almost a jack of all trades. I really love what you do. And just to dive right in, to start right off, I'd love to hear a little bit of background and how you came up and what has brought you to be doing what you're doing right now.
Yeah. So I grew up kind of playing like every sport. Sports were a big part of my life. I think just my dad, he was always into sports, not like competitively, but just growing up, he played football, hockey, like all the main sports. And so me being like the oldest child, I got into all the sports as well. And so that kind of just led to just being like that's all we did as kids. Like we didn't even watch TV. My parents never let us have video game systems, which is sad because now I'm horrible at video games. But yeah, we just played tons and tons of sports, and same goes at school. And we had the opportunity to go into and pursue competitive sports growing up, and eventually I landed on snowboarding. And yeah, just kind of just followed that path, made it onto the national team without really realizing, because snowboarding only had just joined the Olympics, like not even like it was years after I actually first started. And then later on, after 4 seasons on the national team, I ended up retiring from snowboarding. I dove into CrossFit to kind of fill that competitive void. And at the same time, while I was still snowboarding, I was finishing my business school and starting a business, a marketing agency. And so that kind of carries me to what I do now, which is creating content, running my business, and my podcast, and still, training and competing in a bunch of different things. I've had like the last year a little bit off from competition, especially with COVID and everything. So just figuring out my next moves when it comes to the sports side of things.
Right. And I want to just touch on your parents, because you were saying how, they were athletes, they did stuff. And I can completely relate to that, because both my parents were competitive athletes in karate. So just like I wasn't allowed much TV time. I wasn't allowed video games. My brothers play them now, but now at 22, I have zero. I'm not good at it. I don't know what I'm doing.
Horrible.
So I can 100% relate to that. And actually, I find it really interesting because I was reading your website before hopping on here with you. And like, my parents didn't believe in summer camps either. We were outside kicking a ball. They were playing the sports with us. We were really getting involved in activities together. And the whole, like, the mainstream activities weren't what we got involved in. And I found it really interesting because you said your parents didn't believe in summer camp, but they did send you to entrepreneur camp at 6 years old.
Yeah. Yeah, that was interesting. Well, so we have a family cottage. So our family cottage has been like, it's told someone it was like 90 years. Maybe it's not quite 90 years, but it's over 80 years. It's been in the family. And basically it was like this plot of land that my great uncle found or something. And he built a log cabin on it. And then basically like my great grandparents bought it off my grandparents bought it off their parents. My parents bought it off their parents. So growing up, when I was a young kid, it was still owned by my grandparents. And so it was like 3 generations all in this log cabin for the entire summer. And so that was a big thing for my parents. We lived in Vancouver till I was like 5. And then they moved us here because they wanted to be closer with our grandparents and with the cottage. And so we spent every summer growing up there. And it was interesting because like we had our hockey friends, our sports friends, our school friends, but we never saw them in the summer, just my brother and I and our grandparents and our parents. And so yeah, we never really had the opportunity of going to camp, but my parents were always like, okay, well, you're at the cottage, like my dad will put me through hockey dryland training or something, and then my brother and I, we would play sports all day. We would make up 2-person soccer, any 2-person game we can make up, and we try to play games that had no right being a 2-person game, but try to make it happen. And we just did tons of activities like all day long. But actually, when I did go to entrepreneurship camp, I actually also did like a 1-week drama camp that summer too, which was odd. But basically it was actually that, so my dad at the time, he had an invention for public safety, and it was right when we were supposed to move from Vancouver to the Ottawa area. We actually ended up making like a 2-year life change, and we moved to New Jersey for 2 years. And it was when we were there, we actually did go to we drove all the way up back to Canada and spent the summer at the cottage still, but just with my dad's work and everything, we had to stay a little bit longer. And so we had a couple weeks where they were able to send me to this entrepreneurship day camp, and then this like drama camp that I remember. Those are my only 2 camp experiences. So yeah, it was quite interesting.
But the entrepreneurship camp, like I definitely was reading like that. Like, is that what really kickstarted you? Because I saw like you were selling gum. You started your own business with your brother at 12 years old, and I think that's really like that's special. That's really cool. And is that what kickstarted it, or was this like just always an interest? Like you were just
Yeah, I mean, I think I was always just like a young little hustler, like just trying to hustle things to my parents, like buy this, let's do this. I would make a PowerPoint presentation for everything. If I wanted something, it was like, okay, PowerPoint presentation, present to my parents. We had this little like projector. I would like fully sit them down, like, you know, feed them some food to try to get them in a good mood. Never really worked, but I just try to convince them of some sort of idea or thing that I wanted to do. But I think it was growing up that my dad was an entrepreneur, and just seeing that he was able, you know, to like work from home and be around. I mean, there were sacrifices for sure. Like even growing up and being at the cottage, we'd be tubing and he'd have to take a phone call and stop, you know, the tubes in the middle of the lake and be like, okay, I got to answer this or do this. And so there's definitely, you know, you realize, okay, you have to always be on as an entrepreneur, but it was just cool that he could make his own rules and do those things. I think part of it also comes from just like who I was. Like as a kid, I had so much energy and I just didn't like following the rules. And so for me, even like a traditional classroom setting, I was like, this is not my thing. So I always knew I wanted to be like an athlete because I had the sports side, and then like an entrepreneur because I was like, I just want to be my own boss and make my own rules. And so I think my dad saw that, and him being an entrepreneur, he's like, okay, I'm going to send her to this entrepreneurship camp. And yeah, I just remember the entrepreneurship camp was fun. Like we just had to make like an invention. And so we got to work on it, and I got my dad to help me work on this little invention. And so it was good.
Yeah, I can definitely speak to that. My father is also an entrepreneur, so growing up, I completely relate to, you know, being up at 5 a.m. in the morning, answering emails when we're on family vacation, you know, just
Yeah.
always working, always hustling. And, you know, if anything, it looks hard, but that is something now I aspire. I want to be able to live on my own terms. And I can definitely attest exactly what you're saying is, you know, not follow the rules. I want to make my own rules. I mean, I'm a student, I've worked the student jobs, and I've concluded I don't like being told what to do.
Yeah.
So I think that's awesome. So you were mentioning hockey before, and that was originally your sport before snowboarding. So I know that you've mentioned that snowboarding, you hooked onto it for actually like an odd reason. It's not usually why you hooked onto snowboarding. It wasn't actually instinctual for you to start snowboarding, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, so yeah, growing up it was like all the traditional sports. Like I think in elementary school I played on every single sports team, like 8 sports teams in one year or something. Like I was just everything was about sports, gym class sports. I loved the beep test. I loved everything about anything that had to do with sports and fitness. And then outside of school the same thing. But definitely like, you know, of course you're also from Canada and it's cold and winter is the main sport. And so growing up I watched like the women's national hockey team, and that was my dream, and I just wanted to be a professional hockey player. I mean, at that time there wasn't any professional women's leagues, and luckily now there's some starting, and some that are running. But back then I was like, yeah, I want to be on the national hockey team and go to the Olympics for Team Canada. So I was like hockey, sleeping with my hockey equipment. But when we were living in New Jersey, I did take up skateboarding a little bit. I remember I saved up for a year to buy my first skateboard. It was like $14, but my allowance was like 25 cents. So it took me a long time to save up for the skateboard. And so I really liked, I don't know, what it was about action sports, because my parents weren't into action sports at all. But just, I really enjoyed them. Like even I would get a BMX bike and I was into that. Like something about the action sports just kind of took. And maybe just from watching videos or something. And then that kind of led to, my family was always into skiing, especially I was born in Vancouver, so we started skiing at like 2 years old. And my dad he's a pretty good skier, and he's always been really into it since he was a kid as well. And he's had some friends who were quite competitive as ski racers. And so all of a sudden I was at the hill, and I just like saw the guys in my class and stuff were snowboarding, and I was like, I want to snowboard. Like that seems cool. And I like skateboarding. And so based on like just all the other sports, the reason why I wanted to be an athlete is because sports kind of came naturally. Like I played on all these different sports. It didn't take me too long to learn. And a lot of that is just because my whole childhood was literally just being outside, working on balance, playing sports and doing all these things. But when it came to snowboarding, I was like, I'm going to be good. I pointed down the hill and just like tumbled. And I was like, oh no, I am not good. But I think because I saw that it was like so cool, and I saw other people doing it, and then it was difficult, it was like, for me, it was like, okay, that's something I need to like put my time and effort into mastering. It was interesting because like at school, anything that was hard I didn't like doing. It was like gym class is like my thing, and I'm not going to put effort into things that I don't like to do. But when it came to snowboarding, I was like, for some reason, I just liked it, even though I was bad at it. And so that really just like pushed me to just try to like, okay, how can I improve at this? Because I think that I would really enjoy this if I get to a level that I'm not falling down the hill anymore.
Yeah, well, I mean, I started snowboarding when I was 11 years old, and I can definitely say, like, even people now, I'll tell them, like, snowboarding is really hard to learn, but it's a lot more fun to do once you get the hang of it
That's it. Yeah.
versus skiing. But it's like I was 11, I had the ugliest, chunkiest equipment ever, and my dad is an extremist, so it's like the bunny hill was not an option. Like, you're going to the top of Tremblant, you're coming down like first run. So it was definitely tumbling down, and it took me 3 years to just stop doing what I call the leaf, which is going down the mountain and you're
Oh,
going from
yeah.
side to side. It took me 3 years to figure out how to actually point the front of my board down and change angles from side to side. So no, I get where you're coming from. I mean, my skills are still wildly underwhelming. I can't do much but go down the mountain, but I 100% understand. So you started working snowboarding, you eventually made Team Canada. How did that all come to be? Like, you started competing and then you just kept snowballing towards everything else?
Yeah. So I eventually like had to make a decision after a couple seasons, because like I played competitive hockey and that's like almost every day. And so
Right.
in the winter season, it was like impossible to get a day snowboarding. It was like, I think my first 2 seasons I went 3 times or something, and so all I was doing was like daydreaming of snowboarding, and still was horrible. And so I was like, okay, I need to like, do something so that I can actually snowboard. And so it kind of broke my parents' heart, I think, because especially hockey, like you have a scholarship track, you have this Olympic track, and all of a sudden I was like, no, I'm going to snowboard. And them seeing me being like a natural athlete at these sports and then picking snowboarding, that at that time I still couldn't even link turns. So like, are you sure about this? So actually I got like a ton of heat from my parents for multiple years, where they're always like, yeah, actually, even once I was already like fully competing in snowboarding, they were still like, I was on the national team and they were still telling me I could go and get a tryout for the university team if I wanted. I was like,
Oh
what?
my God.
Why are you still pushing this on me? And yeah, so the dream isn't lost of hockey for them. But yeah, so I still like, I continued with snowboarding, and there's like little local competitions, but where I live, especially in Ottawa, like there wasn't big mountains. My parents weren't driving me like far places. Like if we went to Tremblant once every couple of seasons, that would be cool. But it was more like, okay, what's the closest place that we can drive you? Because it's like a huge endeavor to like drive 2.5 hours. I think back then the Highway 50 wasn't built, so it was like 2.5 hours or so to get to Tremblant. So that would be like a big family vacation if we went there. And so yeah, so we just rode locally. I would just get there every day. I started becoming a snowboard instructor so that I could get to the mountain as much as possible. My parents had a better reason to drive me, because I was like, this is my job, I'm making money. Um, and so they probably paid more in gas money than I made at the ski hill. But yeah, they started driving me. Then my brother became a ski instructor. And so then we got driven to the hill more and more often. And so we started doing that. And then they had like a little park, not a great park, but I was just always just doing that in the backyard. I was setting up little rails and going down the steps to try to get speed and try to practice tricks and different things. I would go to the toboggan hill, like every day before school, after school, everything was snowboarding. And then from there, I was like, okay, I decided to enter this competition that was all the way at Mont Tremblant. And I had like no right to enter this competition, but I would literally just search online at big competitions near me. And I'm like, oh, I'm going to join this. So my first competition I actually ended up winning, that was really local, but that was like, it was 2 people. So when I came home, I was like, I won. And my parents were like, well, how many people? I was like, 2. So you beat 1 person, yes. So anyways, so they finally drove me to this big competition, and I ended up coming dead last. And I remember just being so, I guess like just upset, but at the same time, when I look back, I'm like, I had no right to not expect to come last. I don't know why in my head I had built up like it's going to be like this Cinderella girl story that I win all of a sudden, and just all of a sudden I'm a pro snowboarder. Because like I was competing, like this competition had a lot of really really like girls who were in magazines and everything at this competition. So
Lori Bluey was you were eating her dust, basically. I don't know, was Lori Bluey at that time, or is she after?
Yeah, she was after, because she's a little bit younger than I am.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah, so not quite. And then
Okay.
so yeah, I remember that year just being like, next year I'm gonna win. Like I was just so angry and just upset. And so the year after, shockingly, like I started doing some more competitions. I met some like older, like some friends that were about 10 years older than I was, and became kind of mentors for me. And I would go riding with them, and they kind of gave me some guidance, because they were people who had competed a long time ago, and now they were in their 30s, and I was like, like, I don't know, 16 or 17. So they were like good, like mentors for me. And I was able to start going to a little bit more competitions, like at trombone stuff, more often. And then I ended up graduating high school a semester early because I wanted to go all in on snowboarding. So I took extra courses so I could finish school early. Got a job so I could pay for everything. I went out west for my first competition. Ended up actually breaking my tailbone. Came home and just kind of ignored my tailbone and entered this competition again because I was like, this is my mission. I said I was going to win.
Mhm.
And so shockingly enough, I actually ended up winning that year, coming back. And so this was again against all these girls who were in the magazines and everything. And so I ended up winning like a ton of gear, money, a big check, all these things. I was like 17. I remember it was so crazy. My dad and my brother were there and we called my mom on the phone and we were all so excited. I won a trip to California to go to the finals of this competition, and I got to like go on a Billabong, a Monster Energy.
How do you wait, I'm sorry, how do you host a snowboarding competition in California?
Yeah, so Sierra at Tahoe, like the Tahoe Mountains, they have tons of
Okay.
snow. Like when I got there, I think it
Okay.
was like April, and they actually were in the middle of a huge snowstorm. So yeah, it was really cool. It was like a very quick experience. We flew in on a Friday night, competed Saturday, and flew out Sunday morning. But it was really cool. So yeah, there are some really cool mountains in California, up in the Sierra Mountains, Sierra Mountain Range, I guess. But yeah, basically it kind of sprung from there. All of a sudden I won this competition, and all of a sudden, like, you know, companies start knowing my name. I started, you know, getting out, like outside of the country for the first time, beating these girls that I had looked up to and had their images on my wall and stuff. And so it kind of was a Cinderella story 1 year later. And then I just like went back to my cottage for the summer and was just doing normal things, just training and being like, hey, I want to go to more competitions. I had saved up basically to go to Whistler that summer for summer camp. So finally my first summer camp, my first real summer camp, which I basically paid for mostly myself from all the working that I did over the springtime from graduating school early. And that's when snowboarding got announced that it was going to be in the Olympics in 2014. And so all of a sudden it started clicking, because that's like slopestyle was what I was doing. That was what was announced into the Olympics. And I was like, oh, how cool. That would be like a cool goal. My goal then was really like 2018, because 2014 was coming up pretty quickly. And so I went home for the summer, and all of a sudden I got an email, I think in August, and a friend was like, hey, did you see you got named to the junior national team? I was like, what? There's a junior national team? Like, I had no idea, because at that time snowboarding had just gotten into the Olympics, and that was after my season of competition. So I didn't know if there was a ranking system, how anything worked. And so it just turned out that they decided, okay, like now that it's in the Olympics, we need to have this national team program and everything. And they looked back on people's results, and because I had won that competition, it earned me a spot on the team. And so that kind of snowballed everything, because then I had to get a coach, I had to move. I actually ended up like moving and living with my coach's parents so that I could train somewhere, and all these things just kind of started from that.
And so slopes, just to clarify, slopestyle snowboarding, because we're going to be getting to this, but you do get injured at these qualifiers, at these Olympic qualifiers that you go to. But slopestyle, it's not racing down the mountain. You want to just explain what exactly that is?
Yeah, it's funny, because I feel like I talk to people, even I have people on my podcast, and they always like refer to it as a race. They just think that it's racing. I'm like, no. I'm the crazy person who goes and hits like all the jumps and the rails. So you have multiple jumps in a course, and multiple like rail or jib features, and they're very, like, they vary per competition, which is the really interesting thing about the sport of slopestyle snowboarding, is that it's never the same. It's not like, even halfpipe is a freestyle judged sport that's very similar in a sense, with the tricks and stuff like that, and
that's the big
aerial.
air. That's the big air jumps usually.
Halfpipe is like the one with like the trombone used to have a halfpipe, but they stopped because it's cost like millions of dollars to build a halfpipe. So Canada isn't the best halfpipe sport because it's so expensive to actually build a halfpipe. It's basically that like U-shaped ditch, and you go down the mountain and you like do a air trick, land back in it, do another air trick, and like what Shaun White does.
Yes.
Yeah, so I never really had the opportunity to do that, because it's just not many hills in Canada anymore actually have like high quality half pipes. But yeah, so basically all the jumps and all the rails, and it's judged. So you're judged on like the difficulty of your tricks, like your style and your overall, like how clean you landed them, how cool you made them. look, and all these different performance factors. It kind of depends per competition, which is another interesting part about the sport. There's a lot of different, politics and things that are outside of your control. But yeah, that's the difference. Sport racing is like basically it's for time, and this is more like you're doing crazy tricks in the air and getting judged.
And you do have you do have access to the run you're going to be doing before you compete. It's not like, surprise, this is here. You have to jump on
Yeah.
as you're going down the mountain.
So usually, yeah, you show up to a competition and usually have, like, depending how big the competition are, you may show up like a week early and have like a few days during that week to train, and usually at specific times, because you'll be like, oh, it'd be too crazy to put everyone on the course at once. So maybe they'll have like if the competition also has skiers, they'll have the skiers at the one morning, and then the female snowboarders get it in the afternoon, or there's all these different variations. But yeah, you definitely get time during the week to practice before. You definitely have at least one day before, although like small competitions, for example, you'll have like a couple runs in the morning and then that's it. So that's a struggle. But yeah, once you get to do bigger events, you definitely have a ton of time on the course.
The improv is not part of the competition. Being able to
No,
improvise.
it wouldn't go so well.
No. So as I was mentioning before, the Olympic qualifiers, you do get injured. What happened? How did that come about? What happened?
Yeah, so I mean, like my first big, well, I guess I had some concussions growing up, but my first,
it's okay.
yeah, my first big injury was that tailbone that I managed to fight through. The thing about tailbones is there's nothing you can really do about it. So basically, I was like, okay, well, I'll just try not to land on it again and do that event. Managed, I think that summer I hurt my ankle a little bit, but that's pretty normal in snowboarding. And so no, not any major injury. Then the next year, that's when I first had to hire a coach. I had to kind of relearn all my snowboarding because I had just taught myself and didn't have like the background of a lot of the athletes I was competing against. So that season I was fairly injury free, if I can remember correctly, which was pretty lucky. And I think that was the season 2012 maybe. So then the season after, so the way it works is basically there's kind of like 2 seasons running up into the Olympics, and basically the 2 seasons before, you're kind of opening up spots for your country. So each country has a maximum of 4 spots. So they can send like 4 female snowboarders, 4 male snowboarders, for example. Otherwise, basically US and Canada would send everyone and no other countries. I mean, there'd be one person from a couple other countries, but it would just take over. So that's kind of how they make it fair for other countries to be able to qualify people. Because I think for example, for Canadian male snowboarders, we could have sent like 6 or 8 athletes to the Olympics and they all would have done really well, but we can only send 4. Which is, I feel so bad for them because they all go to big events and come top 10, and yet they can only send so many to the Olympics. And so we have to open up these spots. And so we actually ended up only opening up 2 female snowboard spots. So there's only 2 spots for the Olympics. And at the time, like, I know that I'm not in that top 2, and I'm more like maybe like 5 or 6-ish. And so it's like, okay, well, it'd be cool to even just be like an alternate or something. But I still have I always have that like Cinderella story dream in my head. So I'm like, oh, but what if I just win all these events? It'd be really cool. So anyways, of course, we're all still trying to go for those 2 spots. We kind of know one person that definitely has it because she was one of the top pros in the world at that time. And then we're like, okay, that other spot is kind of a wild card of, any of us can really get it. And so I guess 2013, 2014, I definitely had a few injuries, things that kind of held me back, and I wasn't able to go to as many competitions as possible. I had my very first World Cup that I was able to get into. It was actually Lori Bluen. She broke her elbow, and so I was an alternate, and so literally got the call like a day before the competition, like, hey, you're in, because Lori broke her elbow. So I ended up getting to take her spot. And then in my practice runs, I ended up basically exploding my heel. And so what happened was I didn't have enough speed for the jump and kind of landed short. And the way they had built the jump, like basically you're going like, say, 70 feet across this jump, and there's like a flat. And then you want to land on the down because that absorbs your impact. But if you come up short, especially if you land not even just flat, but like on the point where it goes from like kind of flat to down, it's not a good situation.
You crushed your heel going upwards. Is that what happened? Yeah.
Yeah, so I was really lucky because it took doctors like 6 months to figure out what happened. They thought I just bruised my heels. And so I actually ended up going like to Turkey, to all these different competitions afterward, junior world championships, trying to compete. And I always just kept re-injuring. And I was wondering, I was like, I've done everything. I would put my foot in ice baths and contrast baths every day, like nonstop. And it just wasn't healing. And so what actually it turned out was that I exploded the fat pad of my heel, which is basically impossible to ever really fix.
Okay.
And what it is basically like the fat pad in your heel is like held together kind of like a grapefruit, so it has all the sections and then it holds a little fat area, and that's kind of like cushioning in your heel. So they said imagine like all those sections like a grapefruit just like broke, so then there's nothing, you can't fix that really.
No, I'm
One of
feeling
their
my heel right now, and it feels awful. I feel
yeah,
I'm just mauling my heel, and this sounds. Oh my goodness. Okay, so
yeah, it was not fun, because imagine like landing any other jump and all of a sudden it just happens again, or you feel it again. It's yeah, it was not great. And so that put a damper on the season. I always kept trying to like go to the next event and go to the next event, but nothing was really happening. It just kept re-injuring. And so yeah, then it took finally a specialist, a doctor, an orthopedic surgeon, figuring out what it was, going to dinner with different experts to try to figure out what it was. And the only time they'd ever seen it before is someone who fell like 6 stories out of a building. And then they had actually broken like their hip, their knee, like everything all the way up. And then 6 months later, after that healed, all of a sudden they're like, wait, I can't put weight on my heel. They had never noticed because all these other injuries. So the fact that like I didn't injure anything up the kinetic chain is, I think it was kind of mind blowing for the doctors, and it kind of was a testament to like how hard I've been training in the gym and stuff to, keep that whole kinetic chain strong, so that it only was my heel that had broken, basically just exploded the fat pad. So I went through every process, getting like orthotics that could like kind of hold the fat pad in. I went to physio every day, basically with like a really strong anti-inflammatory that I would ultrasound into my heel. And I just did everything I could. And then by the time next season came, I actually was able to get back on my snowboard. And what was crazy was the physio told me, she's like, I talked with the orthopedic surgeon in the spring, and we didn't tell you this, but like he told me, he's like, that girl will be lucky to ever jump again. And so I was like, I think it was just pure will, because I think if they had told me that, maybe it would have been a different situation. But I think it was good that they never had told me that. And I just did everything, like every single day. I went to the physio office every single day. Once I was able to start using my legs again and squat and do different things, I was doing it. And so I was able to recover. They also found like a broken bone chip in my ankle, but they said that could have happened years earlier. Who knows? So yeah, a whole field of things that kind of led up to that injury. I was able to make it back for the 2014 season, but there was just like 2 Olympic qualifiers left, and you're competing against everyone who's going to go on to the Olympics and win the Olympics. And so basically you have to like win the Olympics to make it to the Olympics, because you have to win against all those people. That was my only chance. It was like basically you got to win these events. And so I ended up, coming like top 30, and which was good because they send like 30 some people to the Olympics, but it wasn't enough to open up that spot. And it ended up going to one of my best friends. And so, it was good to see her compete there too.
Did the equipment in any way help? Like, did they say that because a snowboarding boot is stiff, the bindings are, everything is there to hold your foot together, kind of? It's not as stiff as a ski boot, but there is a lot of support. So did they say that like you were lucky in any way because of the way a boot is structured, or the equipment like that?
No, yeah. No, I think it
Really?
was, yeah, they didn't tell me anything about that, but I think, yeah, I think really it was more because a boot isn't that stiff. Like a ski boot is
No.
so much
Yeah,
stiffer, but the
yeah.
snowboard boot especially, I mean, I thinking back, my snowboard boot probably was pretty broken in at that point in the season anyways. So I would just say I think I was just really, really lucky. It was just basically like, getting like a sledgehammer blow to your foot, and luckily
Right.
nothing else happened. I was able to like kind of absorb the impact and like kind of bounce off, and only having my foot as the remaining issue was pretty lucky. But unfortunately that took a long time to figure out even what it was.
And even just not even jumping, but I would just imagine, because if I'm thinking of how my foot will move, there's a lot of pressure that goes to the back of your foot and that arch. I'll feel it in my arch, unless my boots are not good, but I feel it in my arch and that lower
Yeah.
part of my foot. So I can imagine just that sensitivity on your heel, seeing as it's your heel that got it. Like, not only jumping was hard, but just doing that movement with your foot to change angle.
Yeah, I actually did have like some plantar fasciitis after.
Hmm.
And so I used to sleep with like this sock that would like pull up and stretch the bottom of your foot. Yeah, because it was definitely like it caused a whole host of injuries. And it's interesting because whenever I run like more than like 10 kilometers, that foot gets, I can't even put weight on it. This summer I was doing like a day of training series, and I trained like Tiger Woods for a day, and he runs,
I watched some of them.
yeah, that one, I actually could not put any weight on my foot when I came back. Like I walked into the house and was limping and limping. And so I got my boyfriend to put like the massage gun on my foot. Cause we only had like half an hour to like shower, eat, and then go to the golf course. And he was like putting it on my foot and doing all these things. What was actually good was actually all the, like the 4 hours spent walking around the golf course actually helped kind of, so that by the end of the day my foot actually felt a little bit better just from keeping up that movement. But that foot does have a lot of issues now, just with, because it just doesn't have the support anymore. Like you
No.
can't really fix that heel issue. And so luckily, like, you know, it hasn't really exploded again since then, or anything has really happened that's too bad, but it definitely has like some weaknesses.
Okay, and so to come back, so you've hurt your ankle. This is after the competition. I know I read that you had a whole year of trying to come back, but obviously after living something like that, the motivation is not at 100%. You're not feeling at 100%. And so I'd like to just kind of go into that and like, how was the aftermath of this injury and coming back from this, like that 1 year afterwards?
Yeah. Well, I can tell you I didn't land short on any jumps ever again. I actually became known after that as someone who just like goes way too fast. Like even this weekend at Tremblant, they don't have big jumps, but I was like landing at the bottom. I was like, oh, my heels. But it was because I was just going way too fast for all the jumps. But that's what I do. Yeah, now I'm like, I don't take my chances. I'd rather just like go and try to like really absorb. Like when you land really short on the jump, like there's nothing you can really do. But if you go really far, the impact could possibly be worse, because now you're going, instead of 70 feet, like 100 feet, or depending on the size of the jump, and going lower because you're like landing much lower down the landing. But I find that I can trust my legs to like absorb that impact, versus just like landing flat on this knuckle is just not going to be good. And so yeah, I kind of became the person who's like, okay, I'm not going too slow anymore. And that's actually, it's interesting because I think going too slow, making that extra speed check, is something that comes from a place of fear. You see a lot of athletes, like especially coaches will see a lot of their snowboard athletes going into a jump, and they make that extra little turn because they're not sure, they think they're going too fast, and then you're like, oh my gosh, that you just screwed it all up. For me, it was more of like a weather issue, that there was like, the snow was really slow that day, and so I thought that I was trying to go full speed into the jump when I did end up hurting my heel. But you know, who knows, maybe I made like a little scared speed check or something. And so so for me, actually, it kind of like, I definitely had the fear that I don't want that to happen again, and like worried about like, okay, what if I land and all of a sudden it just blows up again? Because that whole season that I kept trying to ride through it, I would be doing really well at competitions, and all of a sudden I land, I think it's a normal landing, and I just feel it all again, and I'm like, oh. And so it's just like very frustrating, because it's like it just felt like I couldn't prevent it. It was like I'm doing everything right, all of a sudden it's feeling, you know, good, and just happens again. And so I think that was just something that kind of clicked with me a little bit, was like, there's so many things outside of your control. Like for example, I was lucky, because of all the training I do in the gym, to not have all these injuries up the kinetic chain. But at the same time, I just couldn't control the fact that my heel exploded. Like there's just these things that you can't control. And most of my injuries that happened in snowboarding all seem to be really things outside of my control, where it's like, okay, I literally landed on my shoulder. It could have been 10 times worse. But luckily I had muscle mass to protect myself, but it's still, you know, it broke, or this happened. And so that's just kind of the interesting thing about snowboarding. And I think that was something that eventually all these injuries did kind of wear on me, thinking that it's like, you know, in hockey, hard work pays off. Like as much as you work, it's like that's going to translate to more speed, more power, all these things. In snowboarding, I felt like I wasn't as much of a natural as my competitor. So I'm like, okay, hard work pays off. I'm going to spend every hour in the gym that I have, do everything when they're out partying. I'm going to do this and this. And yet, you know, it just, bad luck. Things happen. There's politics of judging. There's who gets picked for this team, who gets invited to this competition. There's all these different things, and that definitely wears on you over time.
And it's like you were writing on your website also that in snowboarding, it's not if it happens, it's when, because it's a really rough sport on the body. You can't fall gracefully in snowboarding. You just it's 1, 2, 3, and you're on the ground. You don't, no grace period.
No.
Decide how this is gonna go. So 100%. So what is it that made you decide to, okay, I need to stop this and now I'm gonna pivot? Because there was a moment like that you had to decide that you had to change paths.
Yeah, it's like interesting looking back. It was like so many little things. I think like what was interesting was looking back. I had these at that time I journaled a lot, and so on my trips, especially because you're kind of like alone a lot on some of your trips. Like not necessarily like you always have a team and people with you, but maybe you're like rooming by yourself or all these different things. And so I usually would like record, and I wanted to remember different moments. So I remember looking back in my journals after I did retire from snowboarding and seeing like years prior, like writing in my journals, is this the right sport for me? Am I really like, because I always was a little bit frustrated with, I did come from a very traditional athlete background. And so I was always frustrated with the politics of the judging, because a lot of sports, it's like, this is your score, this is your time, versus like having a judge who just decides something. You're like, are you sure? Like, I don't believe this is, correct. Or they saw something that, they missed something or different things like that. And so that was always something that was frustrating for me, especially also the control of like injuries, because I felt like I worked so hard and yet just like this just strokes of bad luck happen. And there's people who are out partying and don't ever go to the gym and somehow they just never got injured. And you're like, oh, like, how is that possible? But it's really just like luck and chances, in some senses. And so little things like that definitely wore at me, but I think I always was like, no, I'm invested way too much in this. Like I'm on the national team program, I'm competing at these events, like don't be stupid. And so I always would get over it. Like if I look back on my notes in my journal, I was always like, no. I would contradict myself, and the next day would be like, no, I was just being crazy. And so, but then leading into that last season, I had started doing CrossFit and I had found like a group of people that I really connected with. I think that was another issue. I starting to get like a little bit like homesick in my last couple seasons. It was just something I never had expected, because I remember since I was 13, I was like, I can't wait to leave and go to Whistler and go train all the time. But I think it was, you never have the consistency of these friendships. For a lot of my teammates, they're all around the country, and then the people that you meet at competitions, they're all around the world. And all of a sudden I would come back for the summer, and like all that adrenaline, meeting these new people, seeing these familiar faces, it's like gone for like 4 or 5 months. And so that was like weird, because it was like all of a sudden you're just missed contact with those people. A lot of them had the funds to like go to New Zealand and Australia all summer, and I didn't. I had to like work and figure out a way to pay and help pay for the next season and all these things. And so I just found like I would drift away from my friends at home when I was gone all season, because I really didn't have much in common with them. And then vice versa, it was kind of the same thing. And so there was a lot of different things that were kind of, I think, weighing on me for a long time. And then, kind of finding some like-minded people in CrossFit and these things. I left on my first trip of my final season and just felt off. Like I was in Whistler, doing all the things I want to do. And I just felt like I wanted to be at home, which was super weird for me. And so I never really said anything about it, just kind of thought about it and was like, okay, like, let's try to work out what's going on. Then that next, I guess it was January, I went to a competition. I drove down, and one of my teammates while I was there got really seriously injured. And so actually at that competition, basically one of the jumps was built pretty sketchily. By the day of the competition, about 50% of the competitors had either got injured or dropped out, which is like, what sport does that happen?
Yeah.
And so it was really crazy. Like a lot of people were injured. I think 3 or 4 other Canadian girls were injured. There's only 2 of us basically left. We were basically like the last ones standing the day of the competition. And just that was the second time I was with that teammate, basically preventing her from going to shock. She was like puking out blood and asking me whose blood it was, like immediately after. Like she had no idea what was happening, where she was. And so seeing that was really scary. I think I almost went into shock when I was dealing with that. I actually ended up calling a friend and being like, I think I'm going into shock, just from like helping my friend. Going into shock, can you like talk me down from this? And seeing that was really scary. And then seeing her mom had drove like, I don't know, 10 hours the next day to go see her in the hospital. And she talked with the coach and myself and was like, I think we need to talk to her about maybe like giving up the snowboarding thing. And that, like, I don't know, just that statement, just like, it just made me picture like, what if I was in the hospital and like something really bad had happened and my parents were there and they were just like, and when I was a kid, I was like, if I die snowboarding, I die snowboarding, because I love snowboarding.
Right.
But back in that moment, I was like, I can't do this. I have other things that I love to do as well. I'm growing, I'm maturing, I'm figuring out that I have other passions. Like I just realized that it wasn't worth it for me anymore. It was like, if I get this really serious injury, which again, it's like not an if, it's a when.
Mm-hmm.
And my coaches actually confirmed that later on. They were like, we think you have a good chance at the 2018 Olympics. But just remember, like, it's not an if, it's a when of the next injury. You're always managing when that next big injury could happen. And even though I've broken my tailbone and my heel, those technically weren't, really bad. Like my friend who was puking out blood, or people who like tear their ACL and that takes 2 years or something to come back from. So really, it was true. It was like, okay, something really bad is definitely some point going to happen in the sport. And I don't think I just have the mindset to want to put myself through it anymore. And so I committed to the rest of the season. I was like, I have to go all in on this rest of the season because I don't want to have any regrets. I don't want to be like, okay, I quit now, like that's it. It's like, no, like, am I sure about this? So I actually ended up having like, a pretty decent rest of the season. I think I came 4th at nationals that year. But yeah, in the spring came and they were picking the next national team, and I messaged my coaches and said, hey, I'm going to take a break. And really a break meant I wasn't going to come back, but at that time I wanted to keep my door open. And so that's kind of how it kind of played out. There's just so many different factors, I think, that came in when it came to physical health, mental health, and fear, and all these different things. But definitely miss it, but I think it was the right decision.
And you miss it, but you're still doing it. You're just not doing it at a level where you risk injury, which I think is the best decision for your overall physical and mental well-being. It's just you're doing it for the true pleasure of it, and I think that's also a positive aspect of looking at it. It's like now you're really doing it for the enjoyment of snowboarding, and it's less stressful. I'm saying this is less stressful. I think this is positive.
Yeah. It is interesting. Like like that summer I went to therapy, and my therapist had asked me, one of his things was like, write a letter to snowboarding. And I remember that letter it was hard because I think I had so much like resentment to snowboarding because of the things I dealt with that last year and not wanting to be there and all these things. And so that was actually a really good process for me to be like I feel like it's now that I can come back to it and just love doing it. I think for a while, even a couple seasons, it was like, I just don't want to do it unless I'm competitive, or it's hard to just go and just be like, okay, no, I'm not going to push myself. I'm just going to do this. But definitely now I think it's gotten to a good place.
And how was that adaptation when you cut it off? Obviously, there's going to be an adaptation having something that's so big in your life becoming very small. How was that adaptation process? Like, for refining, because obviously as athletes, we'll identify ourselves with what we do with our sport. So how did that go for you?
It was really, really difficult. Yeah. Cause like even any one of my friends, they would introduce me to other people. I was like, oh, this is my friend. She's a competitive snowboarder, or she's a national team athlete, and this and this. And like, that was just my pure identity. And especially just growing up, like all I wanted to be was an athlete. And so it was really hard, like, especially for me, I think one of the biggest issues that I had was thinking like, will anyone want to even be my friend or hang out with me or anything? Cause I found like even just being introduced to people at parties or anything, like it was like, I thought that was the only thing that made me interesting to other people. They're like, oh my gosh, that you're this. And then they got so excited about that. And all of a sudden they wanted to be my friend and all these things. And it was like, maybe, what if all of a sudden I'm off this team and now no one has anything to talk to me about, or no one cares about me, the person. And so that was definitely a really, really difficult, I think, thing to go through. It's like, who am I without this sport identity? And so that was a really, really hard thing to process and deal with, for sure. Because I think in some sense, like, it's just a crazy idea to think that people only care about you for this one thing. But at the same time, there are some people that do, that they might only be like, they want to hype up to their friends that they're friends with you because of this or this. And I think it's just realizing that, like, who cares? It's this is your life, this is yourself. Don't hold on to this thing just because of an identity, or a way that you want people to look at yourself. Like, you got to be happy first and figure out your own things first. So yeah, that was such a hard process to go through. I think it's a constant learning process. Like, even for me, like, I thought I had really dealt with it, but I did still dive into CrossFit after to kind of fill that competitive void, and still, you know, almost to all my other snowboarder friends, for example, they were always staying in touch because they're like, oh, now you're so into CrossFit and you're competitive. Like, that's so cool. So for me, I didn't have to face or really publicly like talk about the issues with mental health or physical health that prevented me from continuing in snowboarding. It was like, oh yeah, now I do CrossFit and I'm competitive in this. So it's really been like the last year and a half that now I haven't really competed in CrossFit in the last year and a half because of a shoulder injury, and then with COVID and everything, that I'm really figuring out like, who am I without any competitive sports at all. And so that's been it's just, I think it's going to be a constant ongoing process, but it's starting to, you know, you start releasing the different pieces of your identity that you hold on to gradually.
Right. And I think it's one of those things that it's only as you were saying, you're looking back on snowboarding now and you're seeing the positives. And I think it's always just going to be one of those things, like in the moment, you don't really know what this is going to do, but then it's later on, you're going to appreciate what it's doing for you. Like, I wanted to touch because now it's ironic because you were saying like you didn't really address the mental health side effects that was having, the physical health, the depression, everything, anxiety. You were ignoring that and you were kind of covering that up with CrossFit. But right now, like, I'm reading that you are a big advocate for athletes' mental health. So like this has all led to a bigger something. And I think athletes' mental health is not addressed that much or enough. And
Yeah.
like there's great organizations now, like the Hidden Opponent by Victoria Garrick, you know, it's coming out, it's getting more seen, getting more coverage. But I feel like athletes are kind of expected to, you know, be like these resilient people that are just like all or nothing, and like we're made of brick and we just go and we're motivated all the time and we're just fine, we're ready to kick ass all over the place. But that's not true. Like I mean, I in my own sport feel imposter syndrome in boxing. I'm always like doubting. I'm like, oh my goodness, what am I doing? I don't know if this is even for me, but it's definitely, I can relate to that. And I think right now what you're doing is really great. So actually, I'd like to ask you, what would be the tips for athletes who are struggling with this kind of stuff right now, who don't have access to the sport, or are like leaving the sport and are juggling that identity crisis? What would your advice be for them?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that really helped me was going to therapy. That was really important. I think even learning that some of these things are chemical, like for me especially, like the adrenaline and the release I got from snowboarding every single day, all of a sudden not having that, and like I saw that manifest into so many personal relationship issues, just myself like trying to get that like adrenaline release from something, whether it's like just starting an argument with someone or getting anxious or having a panic attack or these different things. And so that was actually something that was like, you know, I think I was always like pretty open about mental health in a sense of like, okay, you know, I want to seek therapy, I want to do these things, but I never really thought about the chemical aspect of it,
Mm-hmm.
of like, oh, that makes so much sense. Like I've had this routine of years of like literally just like pushing myself, and especially like in a high risk environment, the snowboarding, that forces you to be in the present moment, because otherwise you could die if you're just thinking of like what you're going to eat later when you're going off a jump or something. And so all of a sudden not having that, I didn't realize like the actual effects that it would do on your body. And I think it took me a long time to figure out, okay, how do I actually, you know, help myself go over that with things like ice baths, and new research on things like saunas and stuff like that actually can help a lot with things like that, because you're getting a little bit of that release and you're building that resilience to stress in a sense that perhaps, you know, snowboarding was kind of doing for me back then. So that was definitely something that was really interesting. And so I definitely would say, I think being open to talking to someone who's professional about it. I think also being open with friends and family, especially when you're dealing with the identity part, they know what you're going through. I think they're most likely going to remind you that they don't only like you because you're an athlete. I mean, I don't think there's many people that just hang around with people only because of this athlete identity, but I think as an athlete, we connect to that and we think that that's why people only connect with us. So I think definitely reaching out to friends and family. But yeah, definitely don't ignore the like physical parts of it. As athletes, I think we're so drawn to, it's easier for us to like focus on the physical aspects. And so having some sort of plan of being like, how can I build myself more resilient to stress, whether it's like cold baths or these different aspects, actually can be really helpful. Meditation, these things that have really shown to actually create physical changes, I think are things that are super important and easier for athletes to stick to, because we can see it as like a training plan in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think doing stuff like that, but then also the emotional side is super important too. And just like go through what you're going through. Because I think I've had this conversation a lot about like, how can people prevent the athlete transition from being so hard? And I mean, there's a few things, like, definitely try to figure out some of your other passions outside of the sport so that you have other things to, fall back on and do when that time comes. But I don't think there's anything that can truly, truly prepare you just for that loss of the sport. So just understanding that you have to deal with it. I think it's like almost like you lose something that you love. Like you can always try to mentally prepare for it, but it's still going to hurt. And so just understanding that and letting yourself go through that.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. And so you were competitive CrossFitter after stopping snowboarding. You've done worldwide competitions, and as I was mentioning at the beginning of the show, you really are a jack of all trades. I think it's the coolest thing because you're doing stuff all over the place, and I think it's awesome. So you run a company called the 93 Agency, which focuses on building your own personal brand as an athlete. And so this is really coming from me, who has no marketing. I don't know how to, like, how would you even go about starting to do that? Because I feel like a lot of athletes, they feel like they can't even start marketing themselves unless they've accomplished something huge. And actually, I was just reading on your website, your slogan is literally, it's not how big you are, it's how big you play, which I think is very cool. So I just want to know, like, how do you even start doing that? Even if you're like a small athlete in the works, like, how do you start doing that?
Yeah. Even going back to that slogan actually came because I was, I remember hearing that when I was a kid. I was just like, I was so small. I went through a growth spurt in high school that like I think I went through 4 pairs of hockey pants in one season.
Okay.
But before that, I was like the smallest kid ever. And so I was actually always told, even playing competitive A hockey, they're like, you're too small, you're too small. And so that was always where I was like, okay, it's not how big you are, it's how big you play. When I heard that, I was like, oh yeah, that's me, because I'm small. It's funny because now I don't consider myself small at all. I just went through this 1 year of growth spurts really late. But for a long time, I was definitely like, as a kid, I was like the smallest kid. And so yeah, that's definitely something that I kind of came to associate with. And then I think when it comes to the sense of like marketing yourself as an athlete, I think it's just, that is so important. It's like, okay, even if you're not the professional athlete yet or this, it's like you shouldn't wait to, kind of put yourself out there and start sharing your journey, because I think the journey is more important. Not just sharing those successes and those highlights. It's like showing people the highs and the lows in the journey. People want to follow that journey, like posting your training, posting, like, hey, I'm passionate about this sport and I'm going to go all in, and people think you're crazy about it. Sharing that process is going to help so many other people do it, versus if you just like are in the background and you never share it, and all of a sudden you come out and you're like, hey, now I'm successful and I do this and this and this. That doesn't actually like help people figure out how they can do it or motivate them to do it, or in any way. But when you actually share that whole journey, the highs and the lows, it really shows like a blueprint to other people. It's like, oh wow, they started here and got to here, and they shared all the process of it. Like, I could do that too. And so I think there's so much more value in doing that, as well as when it comes to being an athlete. Like, it's, when you're a professional athlete, it's great. You get, these bigger sponsorship deals, you get paid and all these things, but that in-between stage of trying to get there is so hard for athletes. And I know, because I lived in that space for so long, where you're competing against, in the World Cup, against athletes who are being paid the most money by Red Bull and all these companies. And yet you're like paying to get to those events to even compete against them. And you're not winning. So you're not winning the prize money that they are. And so it's like, oh my gosh, you're just spending tons of money. And you need to figure out, like, how are you going to afford all this to get to that level? And that's where sponsorships and things like that are really, really important. And having your brand built as an athlete really, really comes into play in that sense. And I think, you don't have to partner with the Nikes and these bigger companies. You can, if you start working on your brand and start putting yourself out there, partner with different businesses. There's local businesses that want to support you and would, pay you money to partner with them, do local events, and like motivate the people in your local community that you made it to whatever level that you're making it to, or you're trying to. And so understanding that as an athlete, that there's like, for no matter what stage you're in, there's always a way that you can be leveraging your personal brand to impact other people, impact yourself in that process of helping and impacting other people. And also when it comes down to just like making more money or getting these connections or these deals that can help you actually fund your career and your pathway.
Something that because you were saying like I think social media is a big angle to be playing right now, especially that social media, everyone's on it, everyone's using it. And I think it can be what I find frustrating is that there'll be like fitness influencers that will get those big name brand deals. All they do is they don't even, okay, I don't want to shut down what they're doing. I think they're doing great and they're very good at what they do, but it's like I feel like it takes away from these athletes who have been working 15 years at this or working 20 years at this, and then there's like this, you know, this influencer who's just, you know, has a naturally maybe nice body and is getting all these athletic deals, and we're all just like trying to struggle to pay our next competition, and they're just like getting all the money and sponsorships. So as coming from like that angle, I find that very frustrating. And I don't know if you like follow boxing, but like Logan Paul and Jake Paul are getting
don't get me started. I wanted Jake Paul to get knocked out so badly. I said the next day, I was like to my boyfriend, I was like, good morning everyone except for Jake Paul. You know what, I don't like to put any negativity out there against anyone. No. But I'm like, why do we give these people who are really like, they've done bad things, they're very problematic, they do not give a good example to anybody, this platform? Like, he has 30 million followers. That's crazy. When he's like, you know, he was caught, like, I don't know what he was doing. He was like in some mall, like stealing things and just all these things that he's done. And we're giving these people a platform. And it just, yeah, that bothers me. Because I'm like, it's not about like, okay, maybe I want to see someone beat him because he's problematic. It's like, I wish he just didn't get the airtime. Like, why are we giving these people the airtime? And then going back to what you said about the influencers, I think it's great that people can make money on the internet, you know, just doing what they love, whether it's fitness or these things. They don't necessarily have to be an athlete, but I do think there is some responsibility that I would put on some of these brands to, like, yeah, it's great, and these people, you know, they're fitness models or whatever, but I do think, especially we see it more in the female side of things, where it's like, you're going to give Michael Phelps a scholarship, not some swim model, the sponsorship. But in the female side of things, actually, instead of giving the female athlete who's the same level as Michael Phelps, for example, on the female side of things, a sponsorship, they're giving the model in the bikini the sponsorship instead, or this. And that's something that I really want to see changed. And I don't want to see it that's taken away from those other people who are working hard at their modeling or these things that they do. But I do think that there needs to be more seats at the table in that sense, that we get these female athletes these opportunities, because it's so interesting how it's like you'd rather Tom Brady than some model, but yet you'd put the model for some sports pictures in the store than the actual athlete. And so I think that's just that's just like a whole loop of issues. And that's something that not to take anything away again from those influencers or those models. I just think we need to get the female athletes up there as well, because they work so hard at what they do, and they need that sponsorship money to even survive. Like, that's how the industry works, to do what they do. So
I actually didn't plan on making this point, but bringing up models for the representation of female athletes, it's kind of changing the expectations of what an athletic body for a woman is supposed to look like. And really, if you look at a fitness model, a woman who actually performs in a specific sport, they're not going to look like that. They're not going to look that. We develop in different ways. So it kind of, on the body image front, it kind of will make, I feel like there's a lot of women who look at this and are like, oh, my body doesn't look like that. I'm not athletic enough, even though they're like 10 times world champion. They're like, I don't look like that.
that is, that's 100% true. And even in the snowboard, and especially like the surf industry, especially the surf industry, because, you know, it's all bikinis and things like that. Snowboarding, we're all bundled up. But you definitely see like some of the top athletes who maybe don't have the same level of male defined attractiveness, getting less money, even though they're the world champions, or they're better than these other athletes, or these influencers who are just being models and used for all the images. And it's hard to figure out a solution, because that is a whole industry in itself. But I think when it does come to sports, it's like, no, like, we need to have these athletes actually, you know, being presented as role models and as the models in these images. I think, you know, I saw a tweet, I think it was a few months ago, and it was a mom who was saying that she went to a store, and the store had all these, you know, these boys, and they were kicking the soccer ball and doing these sports, and then the female pictures were just posed. And the girl asked her mom, she said, how come the girls in the picture aren't doing anything? How come it just poses? And she was like, you know what? You're right. And somehow with the store, she ended up actually getting her daughter in a picture up on the store doing something, and not posed, like a mid-sport shot. And I thought that was so cool. And you see that these girls, you know, from a young age, they're seeing this and they're being like questioning it. And then it becomes normal because you get used to it. And I think that's something that definitely needs to change. I think that having these female athletes put in the limelight, and exactly what you said, like we're having these bodies put as soccer players of this, but it's just models. These aren't actually what you would look like to perform. Like even look at Tom Brady. He's not this huge ripped guy, but yet they're still putting him in these images and showing, and I think that does that really helps. It shows people, like, for a male body image, it's like, okay, you know what, Tom Brady is the best quarterback of all time, and he doesn't have to be this ripped athlete. In fact, that might actually hinder his performance, having tighter muscles. He's all about longevity and being really flexible and all these things. And so I think the same thing goes on the female athlete side. I think the issue is that a lot of the marketing really is towards attractiveness, and it's okay, here's what's attractive to men, and then how do we make young girls also want to be attractive to men. And I think that just it's a gross when you
it's
think about it.
very creepy. Yeah.
But it's just so ingrained in our culture, right? Like you see how many girls quit sports as teens, and a lot of that stems from maybe they're bullied by guys, that they don't think that the guys will like athletes, or all these things. And that's just it's just ingrained in the culture. And I think it's definitely something that needs to change somehow. But it's just some of these cultural issues are just so deeply ingrained that it's going to take a while. But I think, people are starting to really call these things out and make these changes. And we are starting to see these female athletes being put up on a pedestal as role models. And I think that's a good stride to be making.
Yeah, and actually, I was listening to your episode with Ruth Hamlin, the episode you published over the weekend. Really good episode. It was super interesting. And you said something that, I guess we all kind of know, but don't really address. And it's that, women make up 50% of the market, but we're 4% of the media. Yeah. And I think that is absolutely ridiculous, because it's true. Like you were saying, how basically women, girls, they kind of stop sports at a young age, and I think that's super problematic. I don't stand for that at all. I think it's a really big issue. And it's, yes, you were saying like attractiveness for guys, but also I feel it also stems from, we're not expected to even be able to make a career from sports. So why pursue it if you're not going to be able to do anything with it? And I think that's a huge issue, especially like to come back to like boxing. Well, women in boxing, like, to talk about the Logan Paul fight, not the Logan Paul fight, the Jake Paul fight, like he made more from that fight that he did on Saturday compared to like 10 different female fighters made this year. And that's a huge, like, I don't, what are your thoughts on that? Because that's,
yeah, I mean, it's just, it's definitely frustrating. I think, and I think it's so true. You touched on the point that, like girls that all of a sudden they also have the pressure, not just the pressure from, culturally, like we touched on already, but, to focus on school, because school is what's going to end up getting them a career, or security. Or maybe their parents have old school thinking where it's like, no, you need to get a husband and this. And so you need to just focus on like, being, attractive to the other sex, and focusing on your school and these things. And so I think that's just, again, it's cultural. But like a crazy story is I recently went to, like, the summer when I was filming those day of training videos, I needed to get soccer cleats, because I was like, okay, well, soccer cleats are good for any sport that I need to have cleats for. Especially after I did the football training and I didn't have any cleats for that one. So I was like, okay, I need to go get some cleats. So I went with my boyfriend to the Nike outlet store and was like, okay, I'm going to go get some soccer cleats. And I asked them, hey, do you have any soccer cleats? And they were like, oh, no, we don't have any women's soccer cleats. And I looked, and they had no women's sports shoes other than running, or like fitness in general. They had none. And then if you wanted basketball, soccer, anything, it's all men's. And they would say, okay, so you would be this size in men's, so here's like the men's shoe. And I'm like, wait, why would you have, like, in Ottawa especially, there's probably more female soccer players than male soccer players. Like I can almost guarantee that. Like soccer is a big sport here for a lot of women. And a lot of people play it maybe even instead of hockey. And so it's huge. And you see then there's no shoes offered. And I was like, what? Like, this was I was just seeing this from a whole new lens, and I was like, this is not okay. Like, what? Like, why is there not, you're like forcing young girls, that's, kind of enforcing the stereotype. If they go to get soccer cleats and they're like, well, there's no women ones, you have to wear the men's ones. How is that going to enforce their belief that, women can be these professional athletes or these things? And especially when there actually is more female soccer players in the city. Don't quote me on that, because I don't know for sure, but just from my own seeing, I think that there are. And then even just looking through the clothing sections, they put women's training, so like fitness clothes, And then the men's side, men's basketball, men's this,
Oh.
like it's all sport specific clothing on the men's side, and women's
This is
side is
in the
just
Nike
general
store.
fitness. This is just a general like Nike outlet store.
Oh, wow.
And so, yeah, that just like really bothered me because I was like, what? Like, it just didn't make any sense to me that they wouldn't have, you know, like women's sports shoes specifically or all these things. And it is true. Like you go into any sport store and you want basketball shoes or soccer cleats or all these things. Most of the sport specific gear is going to be on the men's side, and women, they'll just put like gym gear or this. And it's like, that just does not help.
No, and to come back to branding, because now that we're on the topic of women, I feel like there's, well, I know from my own experience, I'm in a gym where, you know, I'm with a lot of high level athletes. You know, there's 10-time Canadian champion, there's a pro athlete, there's like a boxer. It's all women. We're a women's team. And I don't know if you know who Kim Clavel is. She's
No.
okay, it's okay. So there's high level boxers in this gym, and I just kind of feel like, how do you, if you want to start building your brand as an athlete, how would, like, overcoming that imposter syndrome of like thinking no one cares, no one cares what I'm posting, I'm not this yet. So what would you do? Like, you just, like you're saying, posting training videos, posting this and that. So how do you even just start? Because like imposter syndrome was something I'll feel. So how do you do that?
Yeah, I think also recognizing, I think the thing about imposter syndrome is everyone feels it. Like the
Mm-hmm.
best in the world still feel it. They're like, how am I even here? The best in the world, who cares about what I'm doing? Like, this is all going to get taken away from me at some point. And so recognizing that feeling is never going to go away. And so just doing things despite it. And even as you do things, it almost builds up a little bit more belief, I think. So as you're sharing things and posting things, you're like, oh, like, you know, you start getting more used to it. I think at the start, it definitely is vulnerable. Like I definitely had that issue too, where, for example, growing up, I always thought, okay, like all these struggles that I'm going through, whether it's with my physical health, mental health, it's like someday I want to like tell this story, but I don't deserve to tell this story until I am the Olympic champion. And then that's been a big shift for me over the last year or two, where it's like realizing that actually like I can help and impact people even though I was never the Olympic champion.
Mm-hmm.
And that's definitely been something that's been a big shift in me, and it took a long time, I think, to get to that point. But I think it did come from just being like, you know what, screw it, I'm going to just like put out the things that I want to put out, and then realizing the impact that it's creating and being like, wow, like actually I did not need to be this Olympic champion to be able to help and inspire and make an impact on other people, and even just on myself, like the personal growth that I've been through just from posting those things and you know, being vulnerable and doing those things. So I definitely think it's just like recognizing like imposter syndrome will never go away. Doing something every day that kind of builds the confidence and putting yourself out there will make it easier to keep doing it despite the imposter syndrome. And so I would just say just starting to do those things, whether it's, you know, documenting your training or things like that, like, and just being honest with where you are in the journey. Like people want to see that. People want to see, like, maybe people aren't going to relate to for example, Serena Williams. Like some people, like Serena Williams is super motivational, but is everyone going to relate with where she is in her life right now? Not everyone. Some people are like, yeah, she's awesome, but just her story personally doesn't relate with me, or this doesn't. So everyone, you know, something will click from seeing you share specifically your story with someone that maybe they wouldn't have clicked from hearing someone else share it. And I think that's a really cool thing about when you're growing your brand, is like your brand is you, and there's always someone who like needs someone like you to tell your story to help them, because it just didn't click from someone else.
Yeah, and one final question before I get to my closing question. I wanted to ask, how would you start building your brand? Because I feel like it's a lot easier to do if you're in a mainstream sport, if you're doing football, if you're doing basketball, if you're, you know, in those big mediated, like what's in the media, what you see in the media. I feel like it would be easier to go reach a wider audience. So for someone who's very much more niche focused, for example, curling is coming to mind, but you know, something very niche focused, what would you suggest for that? Because I feel like that's a harder angle to play.
Yeah, I mean, it's harder and easier at the same time. For example, you can probably build better connections with the media, the other people, the athletes, the brands in the space of your niche sport much better, where you're leveraging each other to grow each other's brand as a whole, where it's like, okay, hey, curling is a small sport, so you know everybody in the sport and you can all work together on like, how do you expand the reach of this together and collaborate and do things like that, versus when you're in football, hockey, whatever, it's like, unless you're the best, it's really hard to have these connections or break through the noise, because there's a million people posting their soccer dribbling or this. And so I do think there are the unique advantages of being in a niche sport, especially when it comes to collaboration. Because it's like, okay, maybe Sports Center isn't going to post it up as much, but I have a personal direct access to the person who runs this curling company or this, because it's all really close-knit community. And so I think that's definitely an advantage of the niche sport. So just recognizing, like, yeah, there's a disadvantage, but that also gives you an advantage.
I had never looked at it that way. I hadn't looked at it that way. That's really insightful. Because I was like thinking of this before coming on. I was like, well, there's like, I was trying to think of everything I've seen, and it's like I can count on one hand. Then for men, then for women, there's like 2 or 3 gymnastics and figure skating. Like, that's what we'll see. So
Yeah.
unless you're like involved in the WNBA and you're really passionate, it's kind of very like in the shadows, if you will. So I'm very happy with this conversation. I had so much fun. I had one last question that is my closing question, and I'd love to know what your favorite quote or mantra is that you'll apply every day, like that you live by.
Yeah. So when you told me you were going to ask this, I was like, oh, I have so many. And then one came to mind because it's like my recent one, I guess. I would say, like, definitely when I was younger, like, I was a big quote person. So I had quotes all up on my wall. Muhammad Ali's quote, like, about training, like all those things, like about, working hard, and then, because someday it's going to pay off, and all these types of things like that were definitely my big motivators growing up. But now I actually have written on a whiteboard that's like over here, and it says, nothing is great unless it's also at peace. And that's something that's like shifted in my mind now. So before, all my quotes are like about hard work, hard work, hard work. And now it's like realizing that you can achieve all these things, but if you can't be present and enjoy them and be happy, like, these things won't give you happiness. And so that was actually the quote on the back of my iPhone for a while, every time I'd open my home screen, because I was working so hard in my business and all these things, and realizing I was just burning out, and I wasn't happy by, having more money or having these things. It was realizing that, like, really nothing is great unless it's also at peace. So if you want to be the best, athlete, the best this, the amount of stories that we hear of top athletes, top celebrities, top this, that are so deeply unhappy. They win this gold medal and they would trade anything for just being happy or this thing. So I think that's just been my biggest motto, is making sure, hey, like, I need to be present. I need to work on my own presence, my own self, my mindfulness, my happiness in the journey. And then no matter where I end up, whether this external success or whatever, if I'm just like able to enjoy it and be at peace with it, then that's what matters. Because you can work really hard to be this best athlete or this best entrepreneur and make millions of dollars, and if you don't even have the time to be present with your family, your friends, and enjoy that, what it say that money can buy you or whatever it is, and what does it actually even matter?
Yeah, it's kind of, I love that. And it's like saying, if you're not having fun, it's not worth doing. If you don't enjoy it, it's not worth doing. It's not worth your time. So before I hang up and we end this conversation, I'd love for you to let people know where they can find you. Where can people find you?
Yeah, so basically any social media platform. I'm at Natalie Allport, NATALIEALLPORT, and my website's the same, natalieallport.com. And yeah, it's basically where you can find me anywhere. From those profiles, I have links to all my other different projects and businesses and things that I work. So yeah.
Right. You also run the All In podcast, which I think is a super interesting podcast. I listen to it all the time. She has all kinds of very interesting people coming on to talk about all kinds of subjects. So it's really for everything and anything, and I love that. And her TikTok is also very fun to watch, because she's like, if ever you need a motivational quote, for sure she's going to be posting one every like, you post stuff all the time.
Yeah,
so I think that's
great.
So I thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with me. This was so nice.